All right. Good morning, everyone. It's 9:32. I think we should get started. As usual, I have a couple of announcements to make. So the first one is regarding the laddering assignment. We should have the assignment graded by Monday, and you'll have your grades by Monday afternoon. Okay, so be on the lookout for it. And if you have any questions, obviously you can let us know. I also want to remind you that we have two cases in this class, and those two cases you're going to have to buy. I believe it's about $9 or $10. And I personally don't mind it at all if you want to share the cases, right? So one of you can buy it and maybe share it with one more person or two more people. In the second half of the class, I don't have this on the slide here, but in the second half of the class, you guys are all going to be doing a team project. And so you might want to kind of start thinking about who could be part of a team, okay? I will give you the instructions for that assignment. It's called mall assignment. Basically, what you have to do is go into a mall and audit it. What I call audit the mall. It's a auditing assignment. Basically, you have to go in there and then note the set of things that they're doing in the mall that seem like those things are aimed at influencing consumer behavior. Maybe you see examples of anchoring effects there, right? Price anchoring effects or reference price effects. Maybe you see loss leader pricing, right? You may not be able to assess if it's loss leader pricing because you don't know if they're actually selling it at a loss. You may not know what the price at which they bought a product is, but maybe if you talk to a manager, you'd be able to find out. So it's things like that. And I can, this is not something that you need to remember right now, but I can tell you that you're going to collect more information than you can present, okay? So you're going to have to kind of decide which pieces of insights or information that you choose to present. And I'll help you with that a little bit later on, but basically, for obvious reasons, you want to present stuff that is interesting, that's novel, that's different from maybe what we have talked about in class, etc. Okay, so that's coming up. And the reason why I'm mentioning it here is because one thing that you might do with the cases is that you share it with your teammates, right? So if you already know who's part of your team, maybe you can get together with them and buy the cases. One of you can buy the cases and share the cost of the case with them. Obviously, you don't want to share it with 10 other people, right? Because then, everyone's like, give me the case now, I want to read it, right? So you don't want to share it with too many people. Ideally, of course, you buy it by yourself. Anyway, we'll get to that a little bit later on. Just keep an eye out for information about the HBR cases, okay? We're going to discuss the cases after spring break. So we have some time, and we have about a month. But the sooner you get the case in your hands, obviously, the better off we are. That way we know that we have the case, and we can get to it when we have to. All right. So with that, let me get to the course content, right? We've been talking about judgment heuristics. All right. So is there anybody in class who's never, ever spoken up? Estella, have you spoken up in class before? You have. All right. Niharika, I think you have. Right, Niharika? Yeah. Everyone is very engaged. Have you spoken up? What's your name? I'm Donovan. Donovan, you have spoken up? Maybe not. You're not sure. So when to ask you then. How do you define judgment heuristic?
I would say it's like, I'm not sure, judging off of like for something that comes to mind.
Okay. All right. So you remember the definition of heuristics when we talked about Charles heuristic?
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, okay. Have you spoken? Somebody else is not spoken. Marianne, you've spoken. Who's sitting next to Marianne? What's your name? Ishtar, you've spoken? Okay, all right. Why don't you speak up now? Here's your golden opportunity to earn 0 class participation points.
Like judgment heuristics, like rules of thumb.
Okay, that's good. Heuristics are rules of thumb, and judgment heuristics, therefore, are also rules of thumb, right? Choice heuristics are rules of thumb to help you make the choice. Judgment heuristics help you what? Yeah. Well, you probably want to articulate it a little bit differently, and say that judgment heuristics are rules of thumb that help you arrive at judgments, right? And judgments are really estimates of liking, risk, probability, etc., right? And those estimates influence our decisions, and those decisions could be decisions of what to buy. It could be decisions of what to consider, right? When we are making a choice. We talked about three, rather I should say that in the last session, we started talking about, or we already kind of ended up discussing availability and representativeness. We started talking about anchoring. And these are the big three judgment heuristics that are out there, all right? We could talk about a few more, but these three are sufficient for the purposes of this class. I think that you see a lot of phenomena happening in the real world that come under the umbrella of one of these judgment heuristics. And the important point with heuristics, right? Why do people use heuristics? I think it's very important to remember this, is that they help us save on effort, right? They help us save on effort. If you think about our attentional capacity, it's limited, it's constrained, right? We talked about this a lot. If you think about our working memory capacity, 7 plus or minus 1, right? Plus or minus 2, it's constrained, right? Our ability to expend effort on things, that's constrained too. We get tired. We can't really afford to expend a whole lot of effort on, say, for example, arriving at really accurate estimates of what's the probability that we might have an accident if we were to drive, right? As opposed to take a flight. It's difficult to arrive at estimates of the quantity inside a glass, right? Quantity of liquid inside a glass, etc. And so these heuristics help us save on effort, but that saving on effort comes at a cost, right? At what cost? Katie, you were nodding your head. So at what cost does it come?
Because you're saving the effort on that, you're not like thinking through it fully, so you might miss out on better opportunities.
Yeah, I would say that you're kind of, compromising accuracy, right? So you may not arrive at an accurate estimate. You may not arrive at an estimate that's the accurate estimate, that is the real estimate, right? So in other words, there is likely to be a bias. And I wanted to talk about judgment biases in this session, but since we haven't really finished up talking about anchoring, let's start there, all right? And then after that, I'll also talk a little bit about judgment biases and managerial decision making. Okay, so we started with judgments or estimates. So I'm going to go through this really quickly, right? Estimates of value for money, estimates of liking, quantity, risk, similarity, etc. And then we also talked a little bit about what heuristics are, what judgment heuristics are, how do we define them, okay? And right, so I won't really kind of discuss any of these points. And then we started talking about availability heuristic, right? I'll just give you a couple of examples here. We covered more examples in the previous session. Because plane crashes and accidents like plane crashes are covered a lot in the news, they tend to be available to us. And so we end up inflating the probability of having an accident on the flight in an airplane. Whereas in fact, it's much more likely that we have an accident when we are driving, right? Many, many times more. So availability heuristic don't just affect risk judgments, they also affect liking judgments, time judgments, money judgments, quantity judgments, etc. So I went through these examples. So this is just to kind of refresh your memory. We talked about all of these examples, right? And we also talked about quantity judgment examples. In contrast to availability heuristic, which works on the idea that if it comes easily to mind, it must be more likely, right? Or that I must like it more, or it must be more popular, or it must be more risky, etc. Representativeness works off of the idea that if it reminds me of a particular category of things, then it must be that thing, okay? So to the extent that something is stereotypical, that's what representativeness is. And so if the color purple, right? I think this is purple, I'm not sure, whatever color this is is associated with high quality when it comes to allergy medication, then the color purple is representative of high quality. And therefore, when somebody else uses the same color, then we think that that also must be associated with high quality. That must be high quality. Okay. Likewise, we can think of other colors being associated more generally across the whole world, really, right? With certain kinds of traits or attributes. So blue is fresh, green is natural. And so you see a lot of brands taking advantage of these things as well. Okay, so let's talk about anchoring, and we already began talking about it. So the idea here is that a third heuristic that often helps us cut effort is the anchoring heuristic. And the idea here is that if a certain quantity is seeded in our heads, then we don't really move too far from that quantity. So for example, if we are told that the original price of a pair of shoes was $149, then that then becomes the anchor. And we evaluate the actual price that at which it's selling now in comparison to that anchor. And so if it's far lower, then we think that we're getting a great deal. If it's not as low as $100, then we don't think it's as good a deal, right? So that's the idea of the anchor. And I walked you through this example. I had you guys fill out this survey. And we saw here that those in the low anchor condition, in fact, estimated that the average price of a car is far lower than those who were given a high anchor, right? So we can see this happening a lot around the world, right? And in marketing, you'll see a lot of examples of this. So there's a couple of other examples that I walked through, and I'm going to go through these really quickly. And I think we stopped here, right? I hadn't really gotten talking about decoy effect. So let's begin from here. And let me start here again with a survey question that I had sent out to all of you. And in this survey question, 1/2 of you were assigned to this condition, where you saw only one bread maker, and you were asked, what will make this bread maker worth buying? And you were asked how much you like this bread maker, or how much value do you think this bread maker gives you, right? So imagine this is actually a true life story, right? So imagine that you are a bread maker and you're a maker of this brand, and you make this bread maker. This is your flagship model, right? You hope to sell a lot of this, but it's not selling a lot. What could you do in order to enhance the sale of this bread maker? One of the things you could do is to come up with another bread maker, right? Put it right next to it. And that bread maker is far more expensive than this bread maker. What that might do then is it might increase the sales of this bread maker. Okay, and the idea here is that you don't really intend to sell a lot of this bread maker, right? You're only putting it in because it increases the attractiveness of this other bread maker. Okay, so let's see what happened with all of you. So this was specifically the question that you were asked. In your opinion, how good of a deal is this $275 bread maker? 1/2 of you were assigned to this condition where you only saw one bread maker, and the other half were assigned to this condition where you saw two bread makers. And if this provides a arbitrary anchor, right? So in other words, you're not really going to buy this bread maker. You're not even considering it, right? But nevertheless, it does provide a higher anchor. It's sold at a higher price. What should happen is that the same bread maker, right, the $275 bread maker, is seen as being more value for money or a better deal when it is juxtaposed to, right? It's next to a bread maker that's far more expensive. In fact, that's what we find here, right? On average, you guys didn't really think that the bread maker was great, you know, a great deal, right? So on average, the score wasn't very high. On a 7-point scale, it was only 3.5, right? Even in this condition, but it is significantly greater in this condition than it is in the condition in which there's only one bread maker. Yeah.
What's the effect? And I can't remember, but it's like having a very small option that's not good and having a large option that's not good, and you want to come up with an option.
The middle option?
Yeah.
So that's called a compromise effect. And I'm going to talk about compromise effect in just a little bit, okay? And I'll try and clarify what the difference is in just a little bit. All right, so why does a decoy effect, why does it happen? Why is it successful, right? So the idea here is that we are very bad at estimating things in isolation, right? We tend to evaluate things in a relative sense. So we don't know exactly how much value something is giving you unless you kind of compare it to other things that also give you value, right? And so this dot here, is it big or small? It's difficult to evaluate whether it's big or small in isolation, okay? It seems small when it's surrounded by bigger dots, and the same dot seems much bigger when it's surrounded by smaller dots, right? And this is, again, one of those things where even though you know the truth, right, that they're the same size, you cannot but believe your eyes, basically, okay? So that's what is happening here, that in a decoy effect, because we tend to evaluate things, because our estimates, because our judgments are relative rather than absolute, marketers can take advantage of this by putting in a decoy there. All right. So here's another example. This is actually a real world example as well. Cuisinart came up with this oven, convection oven, and they priced it at $179. And that's the oven that they really wanted to sell, right? They also had another oven selling, a basic oven selling at $109. They weren't making a lot of profit on it, right? But that was the oven that was selling more. When people are asked which oven would you buy between A and B, right? With basic features with A and basic features plus advanced features with B, right? Most people chose Model A because people in general were, I guess, price sensitive, right? So then what did they do? They introduced a decoy, right? They introduced a Model C, which is a little more expensive than Model B, and it really didn't have any major features that justified that price increase, right? It only had a few bells and whistles. And so it's a decoy. They're not really hoping to sell this, okay? They really want to sell this, which is the model that gives them the highest profits. And in fact, that's what they found, okay? What they found is that the proportion of consumers who were interested in buying Model B suddenly jumped up. Okay, this is kind of interesting, right? If you think about it, when you have two options and you ask me, which option do you prefer? And I say, okay, I prefer option A, right? If I introduce a third option, my relative preference between these two options shouldn't really change, right? But nevertheless, it does. It's like saying, okay, between a Lexus and a BMW, which car do you prefer, right? And I say, I prefer a Lexus. And then I say, okay, I'm going to introduce Mercedes-Benz into the picture. Now, between Lexus and BMW, which do you prefer? It really shouldn't change my relative preference, but nevertheless, it does end up changing our preference. So that's the power of the decoy effect again, okay? So the big difference, I'll kind of answer Samita's question a little bit now. Between a decoy effect and a compromise effect, I'm going to talk about a compromise effect now, is that in the case of a decoy effect, you're not really intending to sell the decoy that you're introducing into the market, okay? It might even be a low profit margin item for you, right? And you think that the consumers won't find it to be of great value. So you're only introducing it in order to achieve the sale of another option. Okay. All right. So here's the last example of decoy effect. And this is another study question that I sent out in the survey, right? So here you see that one group of you was only given two options. Subscription to the actual hard copy of the magazine that will come to your home, right? That is print and instant free web. So you had two options. One was to subscribe to the online version of the magazine on texasmonthly.com. That was $36. Or you could subscribe to both the print and the online, right? That would be $99. That is a huge jump, right? Almost 3 times. So my hunch is a lot of you preferred the online subscription alone, right? Especially these days, who reads an actual hard copy of the magazine, right? And here, what's happened is that there's a third option that's been introduced. That's a decoy, right? This is the print subscription, which is $99. All right. And that's clearly inferior to the print and the instant web subscription, right? So this dominates this. There's no reason why you would want to choose the print subscription, and they know it, right? Obviously, they know that consumers are smart. They're not going to choose something that is inferior, but nevertheless, the introduction of this inferior decoy should suddenly boost the sales or the attractiveness of this other option, right? Which is what they're hoping to sell. And what we found here is that when there's only two options, not a big surprise, right? Only one of you, I think, chose this one. And I don't know who it was, and I don't want to put you on the spot, okay? But when there are three options, all of a sudden you see that there's a big increase in this one here. Okay, again, it didn't kind of become a majority, but there is a big difference between 5% and 28. Yeah.
I didn't
Patient.
understand what instant free versus like all of the online stuff was.
Yeah, I think basically they just worded it that way, but it means
They
online.
basically get everything too,
Yeah, you get
instantly,
everything.
it's online. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, instant access to it. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the wording is a little bit weird.
Yeah.
Anthony?
What's the 28%?
The 28% is the web plus the print.
Would the print only is at 0?
Yeah, so print only was I didn't put it in here. There's 0 basically. Nobody chose it in this class. Okay. So I didn't even include it. All right, so let's get to another example of a decoy effect that all of you are likely very familiar with when you go to the movie theater, right? Here, the interesting thing is the decoy is not the most expensively priced item, right? The most expensively priced item is the one that they want to sell to you, right? Because the marginal cost of creating popcorn is almost 0 cents, right? Giving you a bucket load of popcorn is not going to cost the people much more money than giving you half a bucket, okay? Because popcorn is literally like, probably, a couple of cents, right? So they really want you to buy this, okay? And they priced it very cleverly, right? There's a big jump from going from a small to a medium size, right? $2.50, that's pretty significant. But going from a medium to a large is only 50 cents, but that's 50 cents of pure profit for these guys, okay? More or less, okay? Maybe 45 cents of pure profit. So they really want you to buy this. And they priced it in a way that this becomes very attractive. In fact, they'll do one extra thing for the really large size. They'll say that they'll give you free refills if you buy the large one, right? And I don't know about you guys, but whenever I've gotten the large size, I've never gone in for a refill because it's already so big. I'm actually disgusted with the popcorn by the end of it, right? So that's the idea here. This is the decoy. All right, so let's talk about compromise effect. In compromise effects, you always have a third option. And here I had a survey for you guys as well. What will increase the sale of the $99 earbuds? And here we see that the addition of a third option that's way more expensive will likely drive up the sale of this, okay? And here, it's a subtle difference between a decoy and a compromise effect. But the idea here is that it's not as if they're hoping to not sell any of this, right? In a pure decoy, really, it's just a distractor, right? It's a decoy. And they're not hoping to sell anything of that particular item. In fact, they may not even really have it in stock. They may just have a display item. Whereas with the compromise effect, they'll actually, intend to sell this. But this is the model on which they're making the most profits. And that's the one that they want to sell. And introduction of a third option usually drives the sales of the middle option. Yeah.
Would they not hope to sell any of these expensive?
Yeah, they're not really hoping to sell that. Yeah, they're not really hoping to sell that. Okay. And here you see again, in this class, what we found is that this middle option, right? What ended up being the middle option in the 3-option case, but it was the more expensive option in the 2-option case. 1/2 of you was only exposed to these 2 options and asked which option would you choose. The other half was exposed to all 3 options. And really, we are interested in the attractiveness of this middle option, right? And we see here that option jumps up from being only 39% to more than half, 54%, when there are 3 options as opposed to only 2 options. The broad point here is this idea that when we judge things, right, in terms of likability, okay, for example, it's not as if we're calculating the likability based off of some kind of internal standards, right? We're looking at the attributes. If you remember the Torah model, right? That's what it claims we're doing, that we're looking at all the attributes, we're calculating the importance of each attribute, we're calculating the performance of the product on each of these attributes and multiplying, it's a bottom-up process. But the judgment heuristics suggest that that's not what's going on. If that's what's going on, really the relative choice between these two should remain constant, right? This option is more attractive when there are only 2 options. This should continue to remain more attractive because it's the bottom-up process, right? What this is suggesting to us is that people are using a kind of a top-down approach, or they are kind of looking at all the options, they're looking at what's surrounding these options, and then arriving at estimates of liking or quality, value for money, what have you, based off of a relative comparison across across options, rather than based off of the attributes of any one option. Yeah, Reed? No, no. In the oven example, it was not, which is why I think Sarah was asking that question. So again, here, we don't need to overcomplicate it, right? I'm not going to have you, answer a quiz question on it, okay? On the difference between the two. I think whether something is a decoy, right, or not, really, only the manufacturer or the marketer will know, okay? If I introduce something as a decoy, right, I very consciously and explicitly am aware that this is not something that I intend to sell much at all, okay? I'm only pushing it into the market because I know that it's going to drive the sales of the other item that I really want. My whole manufacturing setup is set up in order to produce vast quantities of that item I want to sell. I'm just, introducing this into the market as a decoy. In the case of a compromise effect, I think it's more that the marketer is maybe even indifferent between which one he sells, right? In fact, a lot of times what happens is that the expensive item is the one that makes the biggest profit. And you'll see this in the BMW case that we're going to read, right? I don't know if you guys are aware, but BMW has kind of the entry-level 3 Series, it's called, and then they have the mid-level 5 Series, and then they have the luxury 7 Series. The 7 Series makes the biggest profits for them. Okay, but nevertheless, they end up selling much more of the 5 Series, which is like a compromise, right, between the 3 and the 7, than the sell of the 7 Series. The 3 Series is, really the biggest seller for them, right? So because we're talking about an expensive product category, right? So even though there might be compromise effects there, it doesn't result in the middle option being the most high-selling one there. But anyway, yeah, so that's difference between decoy and compromise. It's subtle and you don't have to really kind of overthink it. Yeah. Okay, yeah. What product? Can be cheaper. I don't know if it can be cheaper. It needs to be at least expensive enough that it doesn't make sense to buy it. Yeah, so in the popcorn example, that's what's going on, right?
So, for example, for McDonald's, as 10% and increases that I always go to 20% because the 10 is like $6 something, and the 8 is like the 20 chicken nuggets is like $8. So in this case, the 10-piece chicken nugget could be a
It could be, yeah. If you're calculating value for money like that, and you end up arriving at the judgment that the 20 pieces is significantly less expensive per piece of chicken, right? Then the 10 piece could be considered a decoy, right? But I don't think it's a clear-cut case of the decoy, because you're calculating value for money. Somebody else might say, you know what, I can't eat more than 10, right? I can't eat more than say 12 pieces, so whatever it is. And so what matters to me is the total amount of money that I'm spending, right? And what did you say was the price for 10? 6 point something, and for 20? 8 point something, okay, right. So for them, the $2 difference is significant enough, and they know that they can't eat more than 10 pieces, let's say. For them, it makes sense to only go for the 6 piece, right? If you're sure that you won't eat more than 10, then why would you, right? Of course, you might argue that, well, you can always refrigerate it and eat it later, okay? All right? But don't eat chicken nuggets, right? Try not to. It's not good for you.
What?
What, chicken nuggets are good for you?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I stand corrected. No, go for it. I mean, at this stage, do it. All right?
I will teach you to stop.
Right?
MSG tastes good.
MSG in chicken nuggets, they put MSG in it?
There's MSG in every.
Wow, you guys are like experts on chicken nuggets. Yeah, Samita?
So in like luxury brand, it impacts the decoy effect a lot, but then most people fall for it because more or less like they just want to associate. So how do we define?
So with luxury, we have to take a specific example of it. Okay, like if you think about Louis Vuitton, right? Their bags are super expensive. They're like $3,000, whatever. So when you're talking about those kinds of brands, I don't know that they necessarily have a default there, because they have a very price insensitive target audience. And on top of that, this target audience that they have, these luxury brand target audience, they equate price to quality. And so in a kind of a perverse way, higher price makes the product even more attractive. Okay, so I don't know if you'll have like a good example of decoy effect. The decoy effect, especially when it comes to price, happens more for people who are somewhat price sensitive, and so in categories in which people are seeking value for money. Yeah.
So for in this example of chicken nugget, would that be like compromise effect? Compromise.
Yeah, compromise, you need at least three, okay? You need at least three. And the idea is that you take the middle of the middle. All right. And if you want to think about why compromise effect happens, anybody have any kind of guesses or hypotheses as to why it is that we're attracted to the middle option? Yeah, Katie?
Because we don't want to spend the full bit, but we don't want to look cheap.
Yeah, right. So I think that there is something attractive about being in the middle. It just seems safer.
You don't want to be an outlier.
Yeah, you don't want to be outside. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. So there's a paper on the seminal paper, one of the first papers that established the compromise effect. And in the title, they have the word extremeness aversion. There's an aversion to be extreme. Okay, that's along the lines of what you said. Vee, did you want to say something similar? Okay, all right, yeah. Remind me of your name again. You don't have your name card in front of you. Yeah, no worries. Okay, what's your name again?
Lauren.
Lauren, okay.
For the compromise effect, if you're making something that's so expensive, is like a chance that the company is losing money, making so much of like the so expensive product that it's like actually a loss?
Well, it's priced high, right? As far as the consumer is concerned, right? Well, this is a decoy effect example. Let's take this example, right?
Yeah.
This is priced high. You're saying that the company is actually spending even more money than $170 to make it?
Well, like assuming that those are so much nicer because they're so much more expensive.
Yeah, to me, I mean, I have to kind of think about why that would even be the case. I can't, think of an example in the real world that, that of that phenomenon happening. If the company is actually spending, let's say, $200 to make these earbuds, right? And they're definitely aware that if they introduce it into the market at $210, let's say, because they want to make some profit, they're not going to sell a whole lot of it. Okay. And even if they in fact introduce it at $169, they're not going to sell a whole lot of it, right? They probably have done some market research and they found out that, okay, only 12% want to even buy it at $170, right? And so given that they're not going to sell a whole lot of it, they probably end up saying, you know what, I'll price it at whatever it is that I want to price it at. I'm going to price it at 220, 250, whatever. It might go down further from 12% to only 3 or 4% buying it, but at least I'm making a profit out of that 3 or 4%, right? There's no, sense in them introducing a brand, introducing a version of their product which makes a loss, I think. All right. Okay. So by the way, I know that I asked this question in the last session. If you have ever bartended, I think Katie, you said yes, right? Or no, it was Molly. Yeah, Molly. All right. Anybody here work in a restaurant before? All right. So maybe you guys can back me up on this. Okay. It turns out that at restaurants, maybe actually you guys won't even know because you were just servers. You're not like managers. Were you managers? Okay. Right. So it turns out that when you look at the wine list in a restaurant, right? The wine that's priced in the middle is the one that ends up selling the most, right? Again, extremeness aversion, right? People don't want to appear cheap, particularly when they're out on a date, for example, right? But at the same time, they're probably like, not going to be comfortable buying the most expensive wine. So they go for the middle option. And it turns out that the middle option is often the one that was the cheapest for them to buy. So they're actually making the biggest margins on the middle option. And they know that this is happening, right? All right. So I don't know if you guys can back me up on this or, yeah? Peyton?
And a lot of people get the flight, so it's like $20 versus like a
Yeah.
regular mod that's like 12 and then a large it's like 15 to 18. And they think they're getting more, but their glasses are like
Yeah,
small.
smaller,
Like,
yeah.
flavors, they want to try to flavors it works, but it's really not
Yeah.
cost effective.
Not good value for money, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it fell the large.
Uh-huh. So you would never order it, right?
No.
Yeah,
Also,
good.
I don't like the flavors.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
For more like expensive decisions, like I used to do that for cars, like we used to sell three different versions. The one that was cheaper, it was like the one that he was less profit, and the middle and the top, they were like half the higher margin. But I'm not sure, like, we just did that because we thought that was the way we can attract customers, because they thought like, oh yeah, we have a good price, and then we try to sell them into the more expensive versions. But do you think that works?
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, in general, there is a preference for things in the middle. Okay, because of the reason that you said, which is that we don't want to take a risk. We want to go to the extreme. And so that would work across product categories in general. So it would work in the category as well. Where was this in Mexico?
Mexico, Puerto Mexico.
All right. Thank you for sharing that. All right. So we've talked about all three heuristics. And I say here in the next session, we're going to talk about judgment biases, but really it's in this session, right? So I was hoping to finish all of this in the last session. We didn't get to that. So we're going a little slower. What's new, right? Okay, so judgment biases. So what is a judgment bias, right? So I'm sure that you're familiar with the term bias. It's there in the general language that lay people use too, but it means something very specific to behavioral scientists, right? And to behavioral scientists, the term bias means a gap between what's objectively true and what's subjectively perceived to be true. So you can think about a bias, definition of a bias being an estimate that deviates systematically from an objectively or a logically correct one, okay? Or like I said, you can think of it as a gap between an actual and a perceived judgment. I'll give you a couple of examples of biases, right? So if you think about Austin in the last few years, I've been here since 2000 is when I joined the University of Texas at Austin, right? Here's a graph that shows the number of homicides, right? Murders, for example, in Austin. And you can see here in the 1960, it was maybe 12, and it kind of rapidly increased in the 1980s to a high of 59, 60, something like that. In general, the United States was a little more dangerous as a country for citizens of the US in the 1980s, it turns out, right? Around the US, lots of cities were more dangerous than they are now, including New York City, for example. And then it came down, right? And this is when I moved into Austin, 2000. And it's been kind of like steadily increasing, the number of homicides in Austin. All right. Now you might look at this graph and say Austin is becoming a more dangerous city to live in, right? Would that be a fair conclusion? You say no? Why? Okay, yeah. So you got to compare it to other cities. But if you weren't comparing it to other cities, you were generally only focused on Austin, would you agree with the statement that Austin is becoming more dangerous? Yeah. Okay. Sarah? Yeah, that's a good point, right? If you have double the population, wouldn't you expect the double the homicides, right? I think that that's fair to say that, you have to kind of compare it to the population growth of Austin. And if you look at the population growth of Austin, right, it's gone from about 500,000, right? This is not just Austin, but the greater Austin, right? In the early 1990s to now 1.5 million or so, right? Or 1 million here, 1 million. All right. So compared to that, if you look at the homicides per 100,000 residents, it's kind of remained flat, if anything. Okay. But nevertheless, this is the actual homicide rate, right? Not just the number of homicides, but the rate of homicides per a unit number of people, in this case, 100,000 people, right? So nevertheless, we are likely to base our estimates not on the rate, which is a little more complicated to arrive at. You need to know how much the population growth has been. You need some statistics on that. Rather, what we're going to likely to base our estimates of how dangerous Austin is on what's covered in the news, right? This is straight up availability heuristic, right? The more you see news items like this, with 60 homicides this year, Austin reaches an all-time high, right? That's, in fact, objectively, literally true, that we have never had 60 homicides in a year in Austin ever. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that Austin has become more dangerous because there's been population growth in Austin, right? So we have all these kinds of headlines that basically drive up our perceived estimate of how dangerous Austin is, even though the actual homicide rate might be much lower. So our perceived homicide rate might be much higher than the actual homicide rate. And that difference is what we call a judgment bias. Okay, there's an actual rate and then there's a perceived rate, and the difference between that is called a judgment bias. So what might be an explanation for it? Like I said, it's availability heuristic, right? Crime is being covered by a lot of news media outlets, okay? You see this all around, right? Not just online, but also in the TV news. The implication of this is that, and you might say it's ironic, that people now want to own guns, right? In order to protect them. So it's understandable, but it doesn't necessarily make the city as a whole safer, because the more the number of guns there are, the higher the chance that somebody uses it, right? But it is an implication, right? If perceived danger of living in Austin goes up, it's going to drive up sales of guns. It's also going to drive up sales of living in gated communities, right? It's going to drive up this thing called stranger danger, right? When I was growing up in India, right, my parents didn't care what time I came back home, so long as it was like, you know, maybe 10 p.m. or something like that when I was a kid. And I would play on the streets, I would kind of roam around, you know, talk to people, etc. And then we move here, and that's not at all the culture here, right? I mean, we want to kind of protect our kids and live in gated communities. In fact, one of my neighbors even has this device that they put on their kids, right? They can kind of track them where they are. The sales of all these things are going up, right? Because of this perceived danger. All right, so Lauren, and then B, and then we'll continue on. Yes. Yeah, so perceived is people's estimates, right? People's judgments of how dangerous a city is. And those perceived estimates are going to be based off of the three, or one of the three heuristics that I talked about, availability or representativeness or anchoring. And in this case, it's based off of availability heuristic. Were you there for the last lecture? Yeah, so availability heuristic is, you know, if something comes easier to mind, then your judgments are going to be based off of what comes easier to mind. So a good example of that is that people think that dying in a plane crash is much more likely than dying in a car crash, even though objectively speaking, car crashes are much more fatal, or you're much more likely, probabilistically much more likely to have a fatal accident when driving rather than when flying. Flying is much safer. But the reason why we think that flying is not safe is because that's covered in the news a lot, right? And so imagining dying of a plane crash is much more easy for us to do, just because it's covered a lot in the news. Likewise, because news of homicides, because of rise in Austin's kind of, you know, number of homicides is covered a lot in the news, we tend to think that homicide rates are going up, right? Austin is becoming more dangerous. That's the perceived homicide rate, even though the actual homicide rate is low. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, B?
I don't know if you just answered this, but along with availability heuristic, could this also be like representativeness? Is that the word?
Yeah, representative. You got it. But why would you, so can you walk me through why you think it might be representativeness?
Austin is like a pretty big city,
Mhm.
so like it's stereotypical for like cities to have like higher crime rates.
Mhm.
Could that also?
Right, so if that's where you're coming from, it would be representativeness,
Okay, it's just
right?
how do you get about?
Yeah, so how did you arrive at that higher perceived estimate? My hunch is that people don't automatically think, well, Austin is growing as a city, and therefore it must be the case that it's also becoming dangerous. It seems less likely than for people to actually see news items for Austin's time and then arrive at the conclusion that it is becoming more. Yeah, but you're right. You're thinking along the right. Okay. All right. So biases are important drivers of people's decisions, right? As a marketer, you want to be aware of ways in which consumers are biased, because that can have a huge implication for you, right? If, for example, you believe as a marketer that depression is on the rise, and actually it has been on the rise, right? So that has implications for the kinds of avenues that are going to be attractive to people. So, for example, therapists, right, are going to be big. If you also believe that people are feeling more and more socially isolated, which is also true in general, right? Despite, you could say, actually, it turns out it's because of social media that this is happening, right? Here again, it has implications for what is going to be popular later on. And so, in other words, being aware of biases is an important thing for marketers, okay? I'll give you one more example of a bias, and then let's talk about some specific judgment biases. Okay, and this bias is called sub-additivity bias, right? In the last session, I talked a little bit about something called super additivity bias, right? If you guys remember, basically, a super additivity bias is when you total it up across all possible events and you come up with a number over 100, right? Over 100%, right? For example, if you ask people, here are 4 teams that are in the semifinals of a championship. What is the probability that team A wins it? What's the probability that team B wins it? And so on and so forth. And you add it all up. Usually you end up with a number above 100. And that's explained by the availability heuristic, right? When you consider each team in isolation, you can easily come up with reasons why they could win it, right? I can see why Lakers might win it, right? I can see why Golden State Warriors might win it, and so on. And so when you add it up, you end up with a number over 100. That's called super additivity bias, because it's more than 100, super, right? Over 100. And sometimes you might have the opposite of it. I'll give you an example of it. It's called the sub-additivity bias. So here's a study done in which people are asked to guess how caloric a burger like this might be. And they were shown a picture, right? And another set of participants were shown a picture of a salad first, immediately followed by a picture of a burger, and then asked how caloric they thought this was. Come up with an estimate of how many calories are there in this meal. Okay, and it turned out that people guessed it was going to be 583 calories when it was just this burger, and it looked like this. And they guessed that it was going to be lower than 583 calories when there was a salad and a burger, right? Logically, it's not possible for 2 things, right, to be lower in caloric value than any one of them, right? So there's something that's not logically true here, and that's why this is a bias, that there is a gap between actual or reality, right, in terms of the number of calories and what the perception of the number of calories is. All right, so let's see if any of you want to explain what heuristic could explain this. And if you want to, yeah, read. Anchoring, okay, all right. Okay. Okay, that's good. That's good. Right. Okay. So there's definitely some element of anchoring going on. But at the same time, it's not as if the researchers told them, by the way, a salad is only 100 calories, right? They didn't actually give them a number, right? So there's an additional layer here that's going on. So Samita, you had your hand up, and then I'm going to go with Sarah and then B. Yeah. Okay, that's good, right? So can you explain?
We're so taught that salads are more healthier.
Mm-hmm.
So when it's given with the burger, we assume that it's
Perfect, right? Salads are healthy. They're representative of a healthy meal, in fact, right? And so health means that it's probably going to be low in calories. And so even though we are not given a calorie number with the salad, in our minds, we're imagining that's going to be low in calories. So we're starting with a low anchor inside our own head through an internal search, so to speak. And then we're not going too far from it. Yeah, read. Representativeness is when something comes easily to your mind. What comes easily to your mind when you see the salad? That is low in calories? The reason why your thinking is low in calories is because this is stereotypical of a low calorie item, right? So it's not as if the low in calories is the thing that's jumping to your mind. So the associations that come to mind for certain stimuli, right? Those associations, if they come quite frequently with that particular item, that means that that association is stereotypical of that thing, right? So it's not as if I would say that how do I put it? So in availability heuristic, you're thinking about things that come easily to mind when you're not given any information, right? I mean, you're not necessarily given a picture of something, etc. Okay, so for example, if you're asked what's the homicide rate in Austin, right? It's a question without an image with it, right? So I can see how V's explanation could work there, even though that question doesn't have an image with it. Because it mentions Austin, you might imagine a big city, right? So big cities Austin's growing into a big city, and what's representative of big cities is that they tend to have higher crime rates. Okay, so in that sense, it's representativeness. But here, I don't see the information of the calories being necessarily more available just because it's a salad. Okay, but I'm happy that you're kind of like thinking deeply about this, right? I mean, that's exactly what I want you to do. I don't think that the learning here is necessarily compartmentalizing a particular phenomenon into one of these three categories. Rather, what I want you to walk away with is that, as a marketer, what are the tools available to me in order to kind of influence my consumers in one direction or the other, right? So, in other words, it doesn't matter as much why you think this is happening exactly, so long as you arrive at the right judgment or the right prediction as to what is likely to happen. Do you have this? Okay, so I know that Sarah had her hand up. Did you still want to ask anything? You were also going for representativeness? Okay, so this is, representativeness plus anchoring, I think, right? Yeah, V, did you want to say something? Okay, all right, yeah, right. Lauren?
Does like the certain aspects that you're trying to get consumers to focus on, like in this case calories, does the like anchoring portion of it, like does it have to include that aspect? Like how the salad doesn't have calories, but they're using it, or it seems like we're using it to anchor, like to guess lower calories, or does do you know what I'm saying? Or does the aspect have to?
So, okay, let me see if I'm getting your question. So as far as kind of coming up with a explanation for why this is going on, right? You might say that there is some element of anchoring going on here, right? Because people think of a salad and immediately think that, okay, it's probably going to be low in terms of calories, right? And so they're kind of anchoring on the low calories. But I don't think that that's what the marketers are doing necessarily, right? Am I answering your question or no? Yeah. Okay, you don't seem sure.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay, all right. So yeah, so I think at some level, I want to say the same thing that I told Reed, which is that I don't think it's that important that you know exactly why this is happening. So long as you can predict that this is what is going to happen, in the mind of the consumer, when you show them a salad and a burger, they're going to estimate that this overall is going to be lower in terms of calories. Okay. By the way, I don't know if any of you fall for this, right? You go into a fast food joint and they ask you if you want a drink, and you say, yeah, I do want a drink. And then you end up ordering a diet version of a cola. And then you feel like, hey, I made a good decision, so I've gone for the healthier option. And therefore, I give myself the license to kind of supersize my meal or something, or I kind of get extra cheese because, I've gone for the healthier option. It turns out that actually this is called the obesity paradox, that in the US at least, there are more options available to people that are actually healthier than used to be the case before. But nevertheless, people are, increasingly obese. As a kind of country, we are becoming more obese. And one of the reasons for this is because of this kind of licensing effect that we give ourselves, that just because we are having a diet cola, we think that we can have a, big 24-ounce drink rather than an 8-ounce or a 16-ounce drink. Okay. Was there another hand that went up here? Oh, yeah. Molly?
So would it be a different circumstance if they were to show the burger before the salad?
Yeah. If they showed the burger before the salad, what would you expect would happen? It would increase, right? And that would also be explained by representativeness and anchoring, right? They did not have a condition like that, because that wouldn't be surprising or that wouldn't be interesting, because just the burger, 583, and I show the burger and then I show the salad and ask you how much it is, right? Chances are they're going to come up with 600 or 700 or whatever, right? And that would be logical. That wouldn't be a bias. Good question. All right. So we have about 15 minutes, and I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes about, hopefully we get through a couple of these. So let's talk about a few biases. Let's talk about confirmation bias to begin with. This is something that we're already familiar with. All right. Confirmation bias is the tendency to selectively seek information that affirms or confirms that what we already know. Okay. This is very, very prevalent. So you might have discovered that if you're part of WhatsApp groups, right? And if there are people with a strong opinion in the WhatsApp group, politically, for example, nothing seems to ever change their mind to consider the alternative perspective, right? They'll keep sending you whatever it is, whoever it is that they support, only news items or articles that confirm that view. And, if you rewind back 20 years or so, when internet was a new thing, people were very hopeful that the internet is actually going to make people less biased. Okay, because why? Because you're going to be exposed to all kinds of information from all around the world, right? And so that's going to moderate your opinions about what's true, etc. But in fact, if anything, the reverse has happened, right? People have become increasingly polarized. And this is not just a perception, this is truth, right? So this is not a bias. That in fact, America has become more polarized, India has become more polarized. Okay, and one of the big reasons for it is that even though the internet has everything, right? The things that people choose to expose themselves to is driven by confirmation bias. And so if you have a particular leaning, then you're going to only choose to expose yourself to information that is consistent with your prior opinions. And the reason why that happens, I think, is because it's uncomfortable to be exposed to things that are counter to what you believe, right? Particularly if it's a core belief, it's part of your value system, right? Think about attributes to consequences to values, right? Family values are very, very important to you. Religion is very, very important to you. You're going to be of a certain political leaning than the other leaning. And being exposed to information that contradicts what you already believe is uncomfortable, right? Even though arguably that's what you should be doing, right? In order to kind of like be more well-informed, that doesn't come naturally to us. Yeah, Katie?
Are these biases conscious or subconscious?
Yeah, I think a lot of times they're subconscious, right? It makes sense if you think about it that they ought to be subconscious, because if they're conscious enough, then you're probably going to be motivated to correct them, right? But if you're not even aware that you have a bias, then you can kind of be blissfully, ignorance is bliss kind of a thing. Okay, so I covered a couple of examples of a confirmation bias earlier in the session on memory, if you remember, right? So in general, people believed, right, that George Bush made more mistakes when he was speaking, grammatical mistakes. And in this example, in the study, people are shown this 5-minute video clip where each of them made the same number of grammatical mistakes. But nevertheless, when people were asked later on who made more mistakes, they recalled that George Bush had made more mistakes, right? So that's consistent with this idea of confirmation bias. Likewise, we see here in this example that if you go into a restaurant and the service is bad, then you're going to view the food from the lens of that bad opinion about the service, right? So we have this desire to hold opinions that are consistent with our previously held opinions. So this is another example of a confirmation bias. When I came out with my book, Amazon actually offered me this deal where they said that, if you pay $10,000 to us, we'll get 50 people to review your book, right? And we'll give them free samples. And would you be interested in this? And this kind of thing is called Vine. Okay, that's the name of that initiative, VINE. And when you go to Amazon and you look at book reviews, you'll actually see Amazon Vine, VINE. Okay, and that's what this is. Okay. And a lot of authors are very tempted to do this because it turns out that the Vine reviews tend to be generally positive. Okay, they generally tend to seed this idea that this book is a great book. Right? On average, a Vine review is going to be 4.8 or 4.9 even, right? But it costs some money. Okay, and I chose not to at that point. That's, though the initiative is based off of this idea of the confirmation bias, basically that if the first review that somebody comes and sees there already is a positive review, then I'm going to be biased in the direction of confirming that. You guys probably remember COVID, right? Okay. All right. So let's take a very quick look at this. This is kind of a longish video. I won't play the whole thing, but let's take a look. All right. So. Oops. Okay. There's something wrong with this. The volume thing. So it's not a big deal, but basically she doesn't want to wear a mask, right? On the flight. And then they say you're going to get kicked off and so on and so forth. And then towards the end, she agrees to wear a mask, and this is the mask that she has. Okay. Anyway, she gets kicked off. All right. So people of a certain opinion that, masks are bad are going to continue to hold on to their opinion. People of an opinion that vaccinations don't work are going to hold on to their opinion, etc. Again, an example of confirmation bias. Okay, I want to do a quick poll. Yeah, Sarah?
Service is bad. There's a question on the quiz that was kind of like that, how we see things negative, but it would be like the latter as well. Service is good.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Right, you're going to confirm whatever it is your previous opinions are, right? Or you're going to seek information that is aligned with your previous opinion. Okay. So ready for a quick poll? I want to do a quick poll with all of you. I'm going to show you a question. Don't shout out your answer, right? Think to yourself what your answer is, all right? And then I'll have you guys kind of elaborate on why you chose the answer you chose. All right. Yes or no? Okay, think to yourself. All right, how many of you say no? All right, how many of you say yes? All right, kind of like 50-50. So Molly, you said no? Why no? Okay.
It seems pretty aggressive.
All right.
So.
Okay. All right. Somebody who said yes. Let's see who said yes. Raise your hand again. Okay. Why? And your name is Dalton. Yeah. Why? All right. Can you elaborate why is it a good idea? Oh, good. Good job. All right. So. Right.
Well, I don't think this.
Right. So I have vacations here. Okay, be honest. How many of you guys read it as vaccinations? All right. So why did you see, Molly, why did you see vaccinations there? Exactly, right? So this is an example of confirmation bias again, right? If you think about it, that I have given you a certain lens to wear, the lens of COVID. And when I set it up like that, then you're likely to perceive the world in a manner that's consistent with your lens, right? In this case, COVID. You see other examples of confirmation bias. I think that we're going to have to stop with this. This particular bias. I'm not going to be able to get to the next bias. So chances are that you can read this reasonably well, right? Even though in reality, if you were to actually read what's there, it's like our nick research brigade, okay, university, right? So actually, it doesn't make sense. Right? Most of the words are all garbled up, except that every word starts with the correct letter and ends with the correct letter, and that's good enough for us to be able to read it. So our mind kind of fills in the gaps, right? So we confirm what it is that we expect to see. Here's a really great ad. I really like this advertisement. Okay. It's talking about how the Land Rover automatically adjusts to everything, right? Similar to how you can kind of fill in the gaps and you can perceive reality as it is, even though there's gaps in what's been presented to you. So here's the last example of confirmation bias, and then we'll do the quiz, okay? And by the way, there'll be at least 2 quiz questions I can already kind of remember that we have not covered. And so I'm going to give you guys full points on those. So I may have talked about Listerine before. Did I talk about it? Right? This idea that when it stings the mouth, we feel that it's going to be more effective. You know, there is this saying in English, it's bitter medicine, they call it, right? It's a term. Basically, the idea that we expect medicine to be bitter. In fact, when it's bitter, when it's not good to the taste, we think that it's more effective. And to this day, the original, as it's called, flavor of Listerine is much more popular than the one that they came up with later that doesn't sting the mouth. I once heard this on radio, an advertisement for Toyota, and they said most customers who test drive a Toyota buy it, right? And that was a really good, clever advertisement because it seems to suggest at first blush that, wow, you know, that most customers who come to test drive a Toyota buy it. That must mean that Toyota is the best car out there, right? So seeding this hypothesis that Toyota is really high quality and desirable, etc. But if you think about it, right, most people who test drive any car, chances are they're going to buy it because, you know, they've taken the trouble to actually go and test drive, right? Presumably they've done their homework and they've arrived with the conclusion that, okay, you know, I want to buy a BMW, I want to buy a Toyota. So it's not that surprising when you think about it that somebody who comes and test drives a car is actually going to buy it. But this is a clever advertisement that sets the hypothesis that the Toyota cars are really good quality. And then when you go to actually test drive it, chances are you're going to confirm that, right? Because of the confirmation bias. All right, let's stop there. Let's do the quiz real quick. And then hopefully I'll have a minute to go through the answers. Then we'll continue on in the next session with the rest of the slides. If everyone's finished the first three questions, we can go through the answers. You can just randomly pick the answers for the last two questions. Gaurav, can you tell me where people are? How many people yet to finish? Actually, I can ask the class. How many of you are still working on this? Okay. You've answered the first three questions? Yeah, why don't you just pick random answers for the last two? All right. Yeah. Ah. Oh, I see. Okay. I don't know. We can talk about it later. Okay. All right. Okay. Let me just go through the answers, guys. Oops. What happened here? All right. So what's the answer to this one? Anchoring. All right. Very good. Well done. Answer to this one? Judgment bias. All right. Answer to this one? Biases. Okay. All right. Very good. This one, it turns out it's sunk cost effect, and this one's they fear that they may not select the best option, but we'll get to that in the next class. All right. So let's talk.
Okay, I gotta learn that dance for Friday. And then I can't dance to save my life, and I don't even know, I can film it. No, are you going on Friday? Hey, we're planning on Friday.